Case 1. Natalie Paige Cochran. At a pharmacy in Beckley, West Virginia, a licensed pharmacist ran a contracting business with her husband while secretly orchestrating a $2.5 million Ponzi scheme to fund a lavish lifestyle that included real estate purchases and a Shelby Cobra. By February 2019, Natalie Paige Cochran was underwater financially and under federal investigation for wire fraud. When her husband booked a flight to Virginia to investigate their business accounts, she made a calculated decision. She would use her pharmaceutical expertise to murder him with a lethal dose of insulin, then spend nearly a week reassuring friends and neighbors that he was fine while the drug slowly shut down his brain. The crime was motivated by financial preservation, executed with professional precision, and concealed with casual lies that continued until Michael Brandon Cochran died on February 11th, 2019. Natalie Paige Cochran was born Natalie Paige Jessup in November 1980 in Raleigh County, West Virginia. She became a licensed pharmacist and co-owned Technology Management Solutions, a contracting business, with her husband Michael. To those who knew her, she appeared to be a pillar of the community and a successful local entrepreneur. She and Michael had been married for 19 years and had 2 children together. But beneath the surface of professional success and domestic stability, Natalie was running a massive fraud operation. She had constructed a $2.5 million Ponzi scheme, using investor money to fund purchases that included real estate and a Shelby Cobra. By early 2019, the scheme was collapsing. She was already under federal investigation for wire fraud. Michael had grown suspicious of their business financials and made plans to travel to Virginia to examine their accounts in person. That trip would have exposed everything Natalie had been hiding. She decided he could not be allowed to take it. Michael Brandon Cochran was 38 years old when he died. He was the co-owner of Technology Management Solutions and had spent 19 years married to Natalie. He was a healthy adult male with no underlying medical conditions that would have explained the sudden and catastrophic illness that overtook him in early February 2019. Michael had begun to suspect that something was wrong with their business finances. He booked a flight to Virginia to investigate their accounts and determine whether his suspicions were justified. He had no way of knowing that his wife had already decided to kill him before he could board that plane. On February 5th, 2019, Natalie Paige Cochran canceled Michael's flight to Virginia. Over the next 6 days, she administered a lethal dose of non-prescribed insulin to her husband inside their home in Beckley, West Virginia. Insulin, when administered to someone who is not diabetic, causes severe hypoglycemia, a dangerous drop in blood sugar that can lead to confusion, seizures, organ failure, and death. As Michael became increasingly ill, exhibiting symptoms of hypoglycemia, Natalie refused to take him to the hospital. Friends and neighbors grew concerned and asked if Michael needed medical attention. Natalie assured them that he was fine, that he just needed to sleep it off. She knew exactly what was happening to him. The insulin was attacking his system, and his brain was beginning to shut down. She let it continue. Michael suffered for nearly a week before he died on February 11th, 2019. His death was initially attributed to a medical mystery. No one suspected that his wife, a licensed pharmacist with access to controlled substances and the knowledge to administer them lethally, had murdered him. The investigation into Michael's death began in earnest after the Ponzi scheme Natalie had been running unraveled. Federal authorities had already been investigating her for wire fraud, and Michael's sudden death under mysterious circumstances raised suspicions. Prosecutors made the decision to exhume Michael's body and conduct a thorough toxicological examination. Forensic pathologist Dr. Paul Uribe performed the autopsy and discovered the presence of exogenous insulin in Michael's system. Exogenous insulin is insulin that originates from outside the body, meaning it was administered rather than produced naturally. Dr. Uribe ruled Michael's death a homicide. In November 2021, while Natalie was already serving time in federal prison for wire fraud, she was indicted for first-degree murder. Prosecuting attorney Tom Truman filed the charges. Natalie pled not guilty to the murder charge, though she had previously pled guilty to the federal fraud charges that had sent her to prison in the first place. The trial took place in January 2025 in Raleigh County Circuit Court. Judge H.L. Kirkpatrick III presided over the proceedings. The case was tried before a jury. Prosecutor Tom Truman presented the state's case, arguing that Natalie had used her knowledge as a licensed pharmacist to select insulin as the murder weapon and had administered it with the intent to kill Michael before he could expose her financial crimes. The defense argued that Michael's death was medically undetermined and that the state had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Natalie had caused it. The jury was not persuaded by the defense's arguments. The toxicological evidence was clear. The timeline was damning. Natalie had canceled Michael's flight, administered the insulin, and allowed him to suffer for 6 days while telling others he was fine. On January 29, 2025, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury returned a guilty verdict on the charge of first-degree murder. Natalie Paige Cochran was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her 2 children testified during the proceedings, begging the jury for mercy on behalf of their mother. The victim's mother, Michael's surviving parent, stood before the court and stated that justice had been served. Natalie showed no visible emotion during sentencing. She was transported to federal custody, where she is serving concurrent sentences for wire fraud and state murder charges. She is currently incarcerated at FCY Hazleton and within the state prison system. The case attracted significant media attention and was featured on Dateline NBC in an episode titled The Devil's in the Details, as well as on Court TV in 2020. In the wake of Michael's death and Natalie's conviction, the West Virginia legislature introduced the Michael Brandon Cochran Act, House Bill 2789, which mandates insulin testing in cases of unexplained hypoglycemia. The legislation is intended to prevent other cases, like Michael's, from being missed or misattributed to natural causes. Natalie Paige Cochran is 44 years old. She is incarcerated in federal and state custody with no possibility of parole. Michael Brandon Cochran was killed by the woman he had trusted for 19 years, a licensed pharmacist who used her professional knowledge to select a drug that would cause a slow and agonizing death. She let him suffer for nearly a week, reassuring concerned friends and neighbors that he was fine, while she knew the insulin was destroying his body. The law that bears his name may prevent others from using insulin as an undetected murder weapon. His children lost both parents on February 11th, 2019, one to murder, the other to life in prison. Case 2. Robert Ray Courtney. A doctor in Kansas City noticed something unusual about his cancer patients. They were not losing their hair. Hair loss is one of the most common and well-documented side effects of chemotherapy, a visible indicator that the drugs are working their way through the body and attacking rapidly dividing cells. But Dr. Verdirame's patients were undergoing chemotherapy without experiencing this telltale symptom. The observation led to an investigation that uncovered one of the most staggering cases of pharmaceutical fraud in American history. Robert Ray Courtney, a licensed pharmacist and the owner of Research Medical Tower Pharmacy in Kansas City, Missouri, had been diluting chemotherapy drugs for years, reducing them to a fraction of their prescribed strength and pocketing the difference in insurance reimbursements. Some intravenous bags contained as little as 1% of the prescribed medicine. The patients who trusted him with their lives were receiving almost nothing. Hundreds of cancer patients, including a 73-year-old woman named Evelyn Price, were robbed of their only chance at survival. What made the crime even more incomprehensible was that Courtney was already a multimillionaire. He diluted life-saving drugs for an extra $50 to $100 profit per bag. Robert Ray Courtney was born in 1952. By the time his crimes were discovered in 2001, he was 48 years old and the owner of Research Medical Tower Pharmacy in Kansas City, Missouri. He was a licensed pharmacist with a spotless professional record. He was married and had 3 children. His net worth exceeded $10 million, built through years of legitimate pharmaceutical work and business investments. He was a highly respected figure in the community and a regular churchgoer who presented himself as a man of faith and integrity. But beneath that image was a pathological greed that defied explanation. Courtney did not need money. He was already wealthy beyond what most people achieve in a lifetime. Yet he chose to dilute chemotherapy drugs, stealing from cancer patients who were fighting for their lives, to add a relatively small amount of profit to his already substantial fortune. The greed was not born of financial necessity. It was pure avarice, a compulsion to take more, even when he had more than enough. Evelyn Price was 73 years old when she became one of Robert Courtney's victims. She was an ovarian cancer patient, a mother and grandmother who was completely reliant on the chemotherapy drugs her doctor prescribed to give her a chance at survival. She trusted the pharmacy that filled her prescriptions. She trusted the system that was supposed to ensure the drugs she received were safe and effective. That trust was misplaced. Evelyn Price was one of hundreds of cancer patients who received diluted chemotherapy from Courtney's pharmacy. The drugs that were supposed to save her life were nearly worthless. She was not alone. Across Kansas City, cancer patients were receiving intravenous bags that contained a fraction of the medicine their doctors had prescribed. Some patients received bags with as little as 1% of the drug they needed. They suffered through the side effects of treatment, believed they were receiving proper care, and died without ever knowing they had been betrayed. Between the 1990s and 2001, Robert Ray Courtney diluted chemotherapy drugs at his pharmacy in Kansas City, Missouri. The primary drugs he targeted were Taxol and Gemzar, both of which are used to treat a variety of cancers and are expensive to purchase in full strength. Courtney kept meticulous secret ledgers that documented his activities. He would purchase a fraction of the amount of chemotherapy drugs that he billed insurance companies for, dilute the drugs to stretch his supply, and pocket the insurance reimbursement for the full-strength doses he never provided. The profit per intravenous bag ranged from $50 to $100, a small amount that added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Over the years, he carried out the scheme. Courtney dispensed the fake intravenous bags directly to doctors' offices, where they were administered to patients who had no idea they were receiving diluted or nearly worthless medication. The cover-up was sustained by Courtney's legitimate business as a respected pharmacist. No one suspected that a man of his standing and wealth would betray the trust of cancer patients for such a comparatively small financial gain. The discovery began with Dr. Verderam's observation that his patients were not losing their hair. He contacted an Eli Lilly sales representative and asked whether there might be a problem with the chemotherapy drugs his patients were receiving. The sales representative reviewed the records and confirmed that Courtney was purchasing vastly less Gemzar than he was billing insurance companies for. The discrepancy was massive and unmistakable. The FBI and FDA launched an investigation and set up a sting operation. Investigators retrieved intravenous bags from the doctor's office and sent them to a laboratory for testing. The results were devastating. Some bags contained as little as 1% of the prescribed chemotherapy medicine. The patients who had received these bags had been given almost nothing. Robert Courtney was arrested in August 2001 and charged with 20 counts of product tampering and adulterating drugs, resulting in serious bodily injury and death. Faced with evidence that was overwhelming and incontrovertible, Courtney chose to plead guilty in 2002, rather than proceed to trial, where he would have faced the possibility of life in prison without parole. The sentencing hearing took place in December 2002 before U.S. District Judge Ortree Smith. The courtroom was packed with hundreds of families, the survivors and loved ones of cancer patients who had been treated with Courtney's diluted chemotherapy drugs. They filled the benches and the aisles, waiting for their chance to address the man who had stolen their hope. One by one, family members stood and delivered harrowing victim impact statements. They described watching their loved ones suffer and die, enduring the pain and indignity of cancer treatment while receiving almost no actual medicine. They spoke of the false hope they had carried, believing that the chemotherapy was working, only to learn years later that their family members had been given worthless drugs. They described the rage and grief that came with knowing their loved ones might have survived if they had received proper treatment. The statements went on for hours. Judge Ortree Smith sentenced Robert Ray Courtney to 30 years in federal prison. Robert Ray Courtney is 73 years old. He was released to a halfway house and home confinement in 2024 due to his age and declining health. He served approximately 22 years of his 30-year sentence. The hundreds of families who lost loved ones to cancer will never know whether proper chemotherapy could have saved them. Courtney stole that possibility. He robbed patients of their only chance at survival, and he did it while sitting on a fortune of more than $10 million. The profit he made from diluting each intravenous bag was $50 to $100, an amount so small compared to his wealth that it makes the crime even more incomprehensible. Robert Ray Courtney was not driven by desperation or need. He was driven by greed so pathological that it overrode every ethical boundary and every shred of human decency. Cancer patients trusted him with their lives, and he betrayed that trust for pocket change. Case 3. Kristin Margrethe Rossum, the toxicologist who worked at the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office, had access to some of the most dangerous substances in the world. Kristin Margrethe Rossum's job was to analyze evidence from death investigations, to identify poisons and controlled substances, and to provide expert testimony in criminal cases. She had graduated summa cum laude and was considered a rising star in her field. She also had a severe secret methamphetamine addiction and was carrying on an affair with her boss. In November 2000, her husband Gregory DeVillers discovered both secrets and made plans to report her to the medical examiner's office, an action that would have ended her career and exposed her personal life. Kristin responded by stealing fentanyl from her own evidence locker, administering a lethal dose to Gregory, and staging his body with red rose petals to mimic a scene from his favorite movie, American Beauty. She called 911 and claimed she had found him dead, an apparent suicide. What Kristin did not anticipate was that her colleagues at the medical examiner's office would notice the fentanyl missing from the evidence locker and would order toxicology tests that she had assumed would not be performed. The insider knowledge she used to select the murder weapon was the same knowledge that led to her conviction. Kristin Margrethe Rossum was born in October 1976. By November 2000, she was 24 years old and working as a chemist and toxicologist at the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office in California. She had graduated summa cum laude, a distinction that reflected her intelligence and academic achievement. She was married to Gregory DeVillers, a professional in the biotech industry. To those who worked with her, Kristin appeared to be a dedicated scientist with a promising future, but she was hiding a methamphetamine addiction that had spiraled out of control. She was also involved in an affair with her boss at the medical examiner's office, a relationship that she kept secret from her husband and colleagues. By late 2000, Gregory had discovered both the affair and the drug use. He was planning to report Kristin to the medical examiner's office, an action that would have resulted in her termination and the likely revocation of her professional credentials. Kristin decided that Gregory could not be allowed to make that report. Gregory DeVillers was 26 years old when he died. He worked in the biotech industry and was described by those who knew him as a loving husband who had tried to save his marriage even after discovering his wife's infidelity and addiction. Gregory's discovery of Kristin's secrets had placed him in an impossible position. He loved his wife, but he could not ignore the fact that she was using methamphetamine and carrying on an affair with her supervisor. He made the decision to report her behavior to the medical examiner's office, believing that it was the right thing to do both professionally and personally. That decision made him a threat to Kristin's career and her freedom. On November 6, 2000, Gregory went to sleep in the apartment he shared with Kristin in San Diego, California. He never woke up. Kristin Margrethe Rossum stole fentanyl from the evidence locker at the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office, where she worked as a toxicologist. Fentanyl is a powerful synthetic opioid, many times more potent than morphine, and is used medically for pain management and anesthesia. In the wrong hands, it is a lethal poison. Kristin selected fentanyl because she believed it would not be detected in a standard autopsy. Her knowledge of toxicology and autopsy protocols told her that fentanyl was not typically screened for unless there was a specific reason to suspect opioid involvement. She administered a lethal dose of the drug to Gregory on the night of November 6, 2000, in their apartment in San Diego. After he died, Kristin staged the scene. She scattered red rose petals around Gregory's body, mimicking a scene from the film American Beauty, his favorite movie. The staging was theatrical and deliberate, intended to suggest that Gregory had taken his own life in a moment of romantic despair. Kristin then called 911 and reported that she had found her husband dead. She told responding officers that it appeared to be a suicide. Because Kristin worked for the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office, the office initially handled Gregory's body and conducted the preliminary investigation. But Kristin's colleagues were suspicious. They had noticed that fentanyl was missing from the evidence locker, and they knew that Kristin had access to it. When Gregory's body arrived for autopsy, the medical examiner's office ordered toxicology tests that included screening for fentanyl, a step that would not normally have been taken in a suspected suicide case. The test came back positive. Gregory's system contained a massive amount of fentanyl, far more than would be present in any legitimate medical or recreational use. The rose petal staging, which Kristin had intended to support the suicide narrative, instead raised further questions. Investigators interviewed Kristin and learned about her affair with her boss and Gregory's plans to report her to the office. The evidence pointed to murder. Kristin Margrethe Rossum was arrested and charged with first-degree murder with special circumstances, the special circumstance being the use of poison. The trial took place in October and November 2002. Prosecutor Dan Goldstein presented the state's case, laying out the evidence piece by piece. He introduced testimony about the missing fentanyl, the toxicology results, the affair, Gregory's plans to report Kristin, and the rose petal staging. The defense argued that Gregory had committed suicide, that he had obtained the fentanyl himself and taken it intentionally. The argument was undermined by the fact that Gregory had no access to the medical examiner's evidence locker and no history of suicidal behavior. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The special circumstance of poisoning made Kristin eligible for an enhanced sentence. On December 2002, Kristin Margrethe Rossum was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was 26 years old at the time of sentencing. She filed appeals arguing that the evidence was insufficient and that the trial had been unfair. But every appeal was rejected. The courts found that the evidence was overwhelming and that the trial had been conducted properly. Kristin Margrethe Rossum is 47 years old. She is incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California. Her inmate number is W98074. She has exhausted all avenues for appeal and will remain in prison for the rest of her life. Gregory de Villers was killed by the woman he had tried to help, a toxicologist who used her insider knowledge to select a drug she believed would not be detected and stole the murder weapon from the very office responsible for investigating deaths. The red rose petals she scattered around his body were a final act of theatrical cruelty, an attempt to rewrite his death as a romantic tragedy, rather than the calculated murder it was. Case 4. Dr. Robert Ferrante. The renowned neuroresearcher at the University of Pittsburgh sat at his computer and typed a series of searches into Google. Cyanide toxicity. How to remove treatments from a dying patient. Dr. Robert Ferrante was not researching a medical case or preparing a lecture. He was planning to murder his wife, Dr. Autumn Klein, the chief of women's neurology at UPMC, and a brilliant neurologist in her own right. Ferrante was 64 years old, a celebrated scientist whose work had earned him respect and funding from the university. He was also paranoid, controlling, and obsessively jealous. He suspected his wife of infidelity, though there was no evidence to support his suspicions. Autumn had been pressuring him to have another child, and she was considering leaving the marriage due to his increasingly erratic and controlling behavior. On April 17, 2013, Ferrante laced Autumn's daily creatine drink with potassium cyanide, watched her collapse in their kitchen, called 911 while fake crying, and then pressed doctors not to perform an autopsy. What he did not anticipate was that a UPMC doctor, acting on a hunch, would order a cyanide blood test before Autumn died. The test came back positive, and investigators found the cyanide order Ferrante had placed using his university credentials, along with the Google searches that revealed his intent not just to kill her, but to prevent doctors from saving her life. Dr. Robert Ferrante was 64 years old in April 2013. He was a renowned neuro-researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, a position that carried significant prestige and access to research materials. He was married to Dr. Autumn Klein and had one child with her. Ferrante was financially stable, well off by any reasonable measure, but he was consumed by paranoia and jealousy. He suspected Autumn of having an affair, though no evidence of infidelity ever surfaced. He was controlling and possessive, monitoring her movements and interactions in ways that made her increasingly uncomfortable. By early 2013, Autumn had begun to consider leaving the marriage. She had also been pressuring Ferrante to have another child, a prospect he resisted. The combination of his jealousy, his need for control, and his fear of losing her drove him to consider a solution that would ensure she could never leave. Dr. Autumn Klein was 41 years old when she died. She was the chief of women's neurology at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, a position that reflected years of training, dedication, and professional excellence. She was brilliant, highly respected by her colleagues, and deeply committed to her work. Autumn was Robert Ferrante's professional equal, a neurologist whose career paralleled his own in academic medicine. She had been married to Ferrante for years and had one child with him. But by 2013, the marriage had deteriorated. Autumn was frustrated by Ferrante's controlling behavior and his paranoid accusations. She had been pressuring him to have another child, hoping that it might improve their relationship. But Ferrante had refused. She was beginning to think seriously about leaving the marriage and moving forward with her life and career independently. On the morning of April 17, 2013, Autumn prepared for another day of work at UPMC, unaware that Ferrante had already ordered the cyanide and planned her death for that evening. Robert Ferrante used his position at the University of Pittsburgh to order potassium cyanide, a substance used in certain research applications, but deadly when ingested. He placed the order using university funds, requesting overnight shipping to ensure the cyanide would arrive quickly. The order was processed without question, because Ferrante had the academic credentials and research justification to acquire such materials. In the days before Autumn's death, Ferrante conducted Google searches on his personal computer. He searched for cyanide toxicity, researching how much of the substance would be lethal. He also searched for how to remove treatments from a dying patient, indicating that he was not only planning to poison Autumn, but was also planning to prevent doctors from saving her life once the poisoning took effect. On April 17, 2013, Ferrante laced Autumn's daily creatine drink with potassium cyanide. Autumn consumed the drink as part of her normal routine. Within minutes, she collapsed in the kitchen of their home in Pittsburgh. Cyanide works quickly, shutting down the body's ability to use oxygen and causing rapid organ failure. Ferrante called 911, his voice filled with what sounded like panic and grief. Paramedics arrived and transported Autumn to the hospital, where she was placed on life support. Ferrante followed the ambulance and pressed doctors not to perform an autopsy, suggesting that Autumn's collapse was due to a natural brain anomaly. A doctor at UPMC, acting on instinct or suspicion, made the decision to order a cyanide blood test before Autumn died. The test was not part of the standard protocol for a patient presenting with Autumn's symptoms, but something about the case prompted the doctor to look for poisoning. The test came back positive. Autumn's blood contained lethal levels of cyanide. Police were notified immediately and began investigating Ferrante. They obtained a warrant to search his computer and discovered the Google searches for __quote, _5, __, and __quote, _6, __. They also found records showing that Ferrante had ordered potassium cyanide from a supplier using university funds with overnight shipping just days before Autumn's collapse. The evidence was overwhelming. Ferrante had researched how to kill his wife, ordered the poison, administered it, and then attempted to prevent doctors from discovering what he had done. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial took place in October 2014 in Allegheny County. Judge Jeffrey Manning presided over the proceedings. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically: the cyanide order, the Google searches, the toxicology results, and testimony from the UPMC doctor who had ordered the blood test. The defense argued that Autumn had not been murdered, that her death was the result of a natural brain anomaly, and that the cyanide in her system had come from some other source. The argument was not credible. The evidence was too clear, the timeline too damning. Ferrante had ordered the cyanide, researched its lethality, and searched for ways to prevent doctors from treating cyanide poisoning. The jury convicted Dr. Robert Ferrante of first-degree murder. Judge Manning sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dr. Robert Ferrante is 75 years old. He is incarcerated at SCWO Houtsdale in Pennsylvania. His inmate number is MN1982. He will remain in prison for the rest of his life. Dr. Autumn Klein was a brilliant neurologist, the chief of women's neurology at one of the most prestigious medical centers in the country. She was killed by her husband, a man who used his academic credentials to order cyanide with overnight shipping, mixed it into her favorite supplement, and casually watched her collapse while preparing to fake cry on a 911 call. His Google searches revealed the full extent of his planning. He did not just want to kill her. He wanted to make sure that even if doctors tried to save her, they would not know what they were treating. A renowned neuro researcher used his scientific knowledge to murder his equally brilliant wife, and his own internet history was the evidence that convicted him. Case 5. Dr. Yazeed Essa Rosemary. Essa was driving to a movie theater on the afternoon of February 24th, 2005, when the poison her husband had placed in her daily calcium capsules began to take effect. She was traveling along a road in Highland Heights, Ohio, a 38-year-old mother and devoted wife, when her car crashed at approximately 10 miles per hour. The crash was slow, the kind of minor collision that would not normally result in serious injury. But when paramedics arrived, they found Rosemary unresponsive in the driver's seat. There was no major trauma, no visible injuries that would explain her condition. She was transported to the hospital, where she died shortly after arrival. The cause of death was cyanide poisoning. Her husband, Dr. Yazeed Essa, was an emergency room physician who had been involved with multiple mistresses and was draining the family's finances to support his double life. He had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on Rosemary and had decided that murdering her was preferable to losing half his assets in a divorce. After Rosemary's death, Yazeed fled the country to Lebanon and then to Cyprus, where he lived for years under the alias Maurice Khalif. While on the run, he seduced female guards and even convinced one to help him escape custody, demonstrating manipulation skills that would later become central to understanding how he had operated for so long without detection. Dr. Yazeed Essa was 36 years old when he murdered his wife in 2005. He was an emergency room physician with a successful medical career and a reputation in the community. He was married to Rosemary Essa and had 2 children with her. But Yazeed was living a double life. He was involved in affairs with multiple women, relationships he maintained simultaneously, while presenting himself to his family and colleagues as a devoted husband and father. The affairs were expensive, and Yazeed was draining the family's finances to support the lifestyle he was leading outside his marriage. He had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on Rosemary, naming himself as the beneficiary. By early 2005, Yazeed had decided that he wanted to be with his mistresses without the financial and legal complications of a divorce. The solution he settled on was murder. Rosemary Essa was 38 years old when she died. She was a dedicated mother and wife who had built a life with Yazeed over the course of their marriage. She was the sister of a prominent local attorney, a connection that would later prove important in the investigation into her death. Rosemary took her daily calcium capsules, a routine health supplement that Yazeed had insisted she take regularly. On the morning of February 24th, 2005, Yazeed reminded Rosemary to take her calcium pills before she left the house. She trusted him. She took the pills and left to drive to a movie theater. The cyanide Yazeed had placed inside the capsules began to work while she was behind the wheel. Yazeed Essa had laced Rosemary's daily calcium capsules with cyanide, a fast-acting poison that shuts down the body's ability to process oxygen. He had been preparing the tainted capsules for some time, waiting for the right moment to ensure Rosemary would take them. On the morning of February 24th, 2005, he insisted that she take her calcium pills, watching as she swallowed the poison before leaving the house. Rosemary drove toward the movie theater, unaware that the capsules she had just taken contained a lethal dose of cyanide. The poison took effect while she was driving. Her car veered off the road and crashed at approximately 10 miles per hour, a slow-speed collision that caused minimal damage to the vehicle. Paramedics arrived and found Rosemary unresponsive. They transported her to the hospital, where she was pronounced dead. The autopsy revealed cyanide poisoning. Immediately after Rosemary's death, Yazeed fled the United States. He traveled first to Lebanon, a country with no extradition treaty with the United States, and then to Cyprus, where he lived under the alias Maurice Khalif. He remained a fugitive for years, evading law enforcement while maintaining relationships with women he met during his time on the run. The investigation into Rosemary's death began with the autopsy results. Cyanide poisoning is not a common cause of death, and its presence in Rosemary's system immediately raised suspicions of foul play. A friend of Rosemary's came forward and told investigators that Rosemary had mentioned, in passing, that Yazeed had insisted she take her calcium pills on the morning she died. The comment had seemed innocuous at the time, but in the context of the cyanide poisoning, it took on new significance. Police obtained a warrant to search the Essa home and found the bottle of calcium capsules. Laboratory testing confirmed that the capsules had been tainted with cyanide. By the time investigators were ready to arrest Yazeed, he had already left the country. An international manhunt was launched. Yazeed was located in Cyprus in 2006 and arrested. He fought extradition for 2 years, but in 2008, he was returned to the United States to face charges of aggravated murder. The trial took place in 2010 in Cuyahoga County. Prosecutor Matthew Meyer presented the evidence against Yazeed: the tainted calcium capsules, the friend's testimony about Yazeed insisting Rosemary take her pills, the $500, 000 life insurance policy, and Yazeed's flight to Cyprus under an alias. The defense did not present a credible explanation for the cyanide in the capsules or for Yazeed's flight. The verdict came back guilty on the charge of aggravated murder, and the judge imposed a sentence of life in prison with parole eligibility after 20 years. During his time as a fugitive, Yazeed had demonstrated a level of manipulation and charm that allowed him to seduce women even while in custody. He had convinced one of his female guards to help him attempt an escape, a testament to the skills he had used throughout his life to deceive and control those around him. Dr. Yazeed Essa is 55 years old. He is incarcerated at Grafton Correctional Institution in Ohio. He will be eligible for parole after serving 20 years of his sentence. Rosemary Essa was killed by the man she had trusted for years, an emergency room physician who used his medical knowledge to select a poison and administer it in a way that would take effect while she was alone and vulnerable. The 10-mile-per-hour crash that killed her was not the result of reckless driving or mechanical failure. It was the result of cyanide shutting down her body while she sat behind the wheel. Yazeed fled the country and lived as a fugitive for years, using an alias and manipulating those around him to avoid justice. His manipulation skills were so extreme that even while in custody, awaiting extradition, he seduced a guard and convinced her to help him escape. An emergency room physician murdered his wife for insurance money and to avoid the inconvenience of divorce, then fled internationally and manipulated his way through the justice system for as long as he could. Case 6. Wendy Mae Davidson. Investigators placed a GPS tracker on the veterinarian's car and followed the signal to a private ranch in San Angelo, Texas. The tracker led them directly to a pond, where divers discovered the body of Michael Severance tied to car parts at the bottom of the water. Michael was a 24-year-old U.S. Air Force staff sergeant and devoted father who had been reported absent without leave by his wife, Wendy Mae Davidson. She claimed he had abandoned his post and disappeared. But the body at the bottom of the pond told a different story. An autopsy revealed that Michael had been injected with pentobarbital and phenobarbital, the same combination of drugs Wendy used every day in her work as a veterinarian to euthanize animals. After injecting him with the lethal cocktail, Wendy had stabbed his body 41 times, not out of rage, but to puncture the tissue and allow the body to sink. She tied the corpse to car parts, drove to the ranch pond, and dumped it into the water. Then she logged into Michael's computer to make it appear he had gone AWOL and reported him missing to the military. The GPS tracker unraveled the entire cover-up. Wendy Mae Davidson was 26 years old when she murdered her husband in January 2005. She was a licensed veterinarian in San Angelo, Texas, where she had built a career treating animals and working in veterinary medicine. She was married to Michael Severance and had 2 children. Those who knew her described her as controlling and dissatisfied with her marriage. By late 2004, Michael was preparing to deploy or relocate as part of his military service, and the move would have required Wendy to leave Texas. She refused. The conflict over relocation became a central issue in their marriage, and Wendy made it clear that she would not compromise. She wanted sole custody of their children and wanted to remain in Texas, free from the complications of co-parenting with a husband who would be stationed elsewhere. The solution she arrived at was to remove Michael from the equation entirely. Michael Severance was 24 years old when he died. He was a U.S. Air Force staff sergeant, a service member who had dedicated himself to his country and his family. He was described by those who knew him as a devoted father who loved his children and wanted to remain a part of their lives. Michael's military career required him to deploy and relocate, and in late 2004, he was preparing for a move that would take the family out of Texas. Wendy refused to go with him, and the disagreement created a rift in the marriage that Michael believed could be resolved through communication and compromise. Wendy had already made her decision. Michael would not live long enough to deploy. On January 15th, 2005, Wendy Mae Davidson injected her husband with a lethal combination of pentobarbital and phenobarbital, the same euthanasia drugs she used in her veterinary practice to put animals to sleep. The drugs are designed to cause a rapid loss of consciousness, followed by respiratory and cardiac failure. Michael would have lost consciousness quickly, and death would have followed within minutes. After he was dead, Wendy stabbed his body 41 times. The stab wounds were not the result of rage or a loss of control. They were functional. Wendy knew that bodies filled with air float, and she needed Michael's body to sink. The stab wounds punctured his tissue and allowed gases to escape, making the body less buoyant. She then tied the corpse to car parts, which would weigh it down and keep it submerged. Wendy drove to a private ranch outside San Angelo and dumped the body into a pond. She returned home and logged into Michael's computer, sending messages and making it appear that he had decided to go AWOL from his Air Force duties. Days later, she reported him missing to the military, claiming that he had abandoned his post and disappeared without explanation. Investigators with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations began looking into Michael's disappearance. Something about Wendy's account did not sit right with them. Michael Severance was a dedicated service member with no history of going AWOL, and his sudden disappearance without contact with his family or unit was out of character. Investigators made the decision to place a GPS tracker on Wendy's car to monitor her movements. The tracker led them to a private ranch outside San Angelo. Divers were sent into the pond and discovered Michael's body tied to car parts at the bottom of the water. The body was brought to the surface and transported for autopsy. Toxicology tests revealed the presence of pentobarbital and phenobarbital in Michael's system. The combination was unmistakable. These were not drugs that a person would take recreationally, or that would be prescribed for any medical condition Michael had. They were veterinary euthanasia drugs, and Wendy Davidson had access to them every day in her practice. She was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case went to trial in October 2006. Rather than face a jury, Wendy Davidson chose to enter a plea of no contest to the charge of first-degree murder. A no contest plea is not an admission of guilt, but it allows the court to convict the defendant based on the evidence without requiring a full trial. Wendy was convicted and sentenced to 50 years in prison. The GPS tracker evidence had been overwhelming, and the toxicology results left no doubt about how Michael had died. The 41 stab wounds, the car parts, and the AWOL cover-up all pointed to a calculated and premeditated murder. Wendy Mae Davidson is 45 years old. She is incarcerated in Texas and assigned inmate number 014-02-279 in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System. She will be eligible for parole in 2031 after serving 26 years of her 50-year sentence. Michael Severance was a U.S. Air Force staff sergeant and devoted father who was killed by the woman he had married. She used the same drugs she administered to dying animals, treating her husband as though he were a patient to be euthanized and discarded. The GPS tracker that led investigators to the pond also led to Wendy's conviction, unraveling the AWOL story she had constructed and exposing the truth about what she had done. Case 7. Dr. Martin McNeil. The doctor and lawyer pressured his wife into getting a facelift she did not want. Dr. Martin McNeil was 51 years old, a clinical director at a Utah State Developmental Center, and the father of 8 children. He held both a medical degree and a law degree, credentials that gave him the knowledge and authority to manipulate both medical and legal systems. He was also a narcissist who was carrying on an affair with a woman named Gypsy Willis and had decided that he wanted to replace his wife Michelle with his mistress. Michelle McNeil was a 50-year-old former beauty queen and devoted mother who had no desire for cosmetic surgery. But Martin pressured her relentlessly until she agreed. The facelift was not about improving Michelle's appearance. It was about creating a medical situation that would make her dependent on prescription medications that Martin would control. On April 11th, 2007, days after Michelle's surgery, Martin heavily overmedicated her with a cocktail of Valium, Percocet, Phenergan, and Ambien, then drowned her in the bathtub. He claimed she had fallen into the tub due to a heart condition. Days after Michelle's funeral, Martin hired Gypsy Willis as the family's nanny. His 6-year-old daughter had been the one to find her mother's body in the bathtub. Dr. Martin McNeil was 51 years old when he murdered his wife. He was a doctor and a lawyer, a man with the credentials and intelligence to navigate complex systems and exploit them to his advantage. He served as the clinical director of a Utah State Developmental Center, a position of authority and trust. He was the father of 8 children, some of whom were adopted. Martin had a history of falsifying documents, including records related to his adopted children, and was known to be manipulative and narcissistic. By 2007, he was deeply involved in an affair with a woman named Gypsy Willis, and he had decided that he wanted to be with her without the complications of divorce. Martin began pressuring Michelle to undergo cosmetic surgery, specifically a facelift, despite the fact that she had no interest in the procedure. He insisted that the surgery was necessary and continued to push until Michelle relented. The facelift was a setup. It gave Martin a legitimate reason to control Michelle's medications during her recovery, and it created a situation where her sudden death could be attributed to post-surgical complications. Michelle McNeil was 50 years old when she died. She was a former beauty queen and a devoted mother to the 8 children she and Martin had raised together. Michelle did not want cosmetic surgery. She was comfortable with her appearance and saw no need for a facelift. But Martin pressured her relentlessly, using his medical expertise to convince her that the procedure was safe and beneficial. Michelle eventually agreed, trusting that her husband, a doctor, had her best interests in mind. She underwent the facelift procedure and returned home to recover. During her recovery, she was dependent on the medications Martin prescribed and administered. She trusted him completely. In the days following Michelle's facelift surgery, Martin McNeil prescribed and administered a cocktail of medications that included Valium, Percocet, Phenergan, and Ambien. Each of these drugs is a central nervous system depressant, and when combined, they create a dangerous and potentially lethal effect. Martin claimed the medications were necessary for Michelle's post-surgery recovery, but the combination and dosage far exceeded what would be medically appropriate. On April 11, 2007, Michelle was heavily sedated by the drug cocktail. She was incapacitated, unable to move or call for help. Martin placed her in the bathtub and drowned her. When she was discovered, Martin claimed that she had fallen into the tub due to a heart condition and had drowned accidentally. The 6-year-old daughter who found her mother's body in the bathtub was traumatized by the scene. Martin called 911 and performed what appeared to be desperate attempts to revive Michelle, but the performance was hollow. Within days of Michelle's funeral, Martin hired Gypsy Willis, his mistress, to work as the family's nanny. The brazenness of the move shocked those who knew the family. The initial investigation into Michelle's death treated it as an accidental drowning, possibly caused by a heart condition or post-surgical complications. But Michelle's older daughters were suspicious. They had seen their father's behavior in the days leading up to their mother's death and in the immediate aftermath, and they did not believe his story. The daughters began their own investigation, gathering evidence of Martin's affair with Gypsy Willis and documenting the medications he had given Michelle. They brought their findings to the police and demanded that the case be reopened. A toxicology examination of Michelle's body revealed a massive, lethal combination of central nervous system depressants in her system. The dosage and combination were not consistent with post-surgical recovery. They were consistent with intentional overdose. Investigators also uncovered evidence that Martin had pressured Michelle into the facelift and had been controlling her medications throughout her recovery. Martin McNeil was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. The trial took place in October 2013 in Utah County. The prosecution presented the toxicology evidence, testimony from Michelle's daughters about their father's controlling behavior and his affair with Gypsy Willis, and evidence that Martin had hired his mistress as the family nanny immediately after Michelle's death. The defense argued that Michelle had died accidentally, that the medications had been prescribed appropriately, and that Martin's relationship with Gypsy Willis had begun after Michelle's death. The jury returned guilty verdicts on both charges. The judge imposed 15 years to life. The conviction was a victory for Michelle's daughters, who had refused to let their mother's death be written off as an accident and had fought for years to bring their father to justice. Dr. Martin McNeil did not serve his full sentence. On April 9, 2017, he was found dead in his prison cell. He had committed suicide. He was 61 years old. Michelle McNeil was a former beauty queen and devoted mother who was pressured into a surgery she did not want, and then killed by the man who claimed to love her. Martin McNeil used his medical license to prescribe the lethal drugs under the guise of post-surgery recovery and essentially tricked his wife into taking her own poison. He drowned her in the bathtub while she was incapacitated and hired his mistress as the family nanny days after the funeral. His 6-year-old daughter found her mother's body. His older daughters spent years fighting for justice and their relentless investigation brought him to trial. Martin McNeil's suicide in prison denied Michelle's family the full measure of justice they had sought, but his conviction ensured that the truth about what he had done was part of the public record. Case 8. Oliver O'Quinn. The autopsy revealed a tiny needle puncture on the body of Michelle Herndon, a 24-year-old University of Florida student who had been found dead in her home in Gainesville on November 8, 2005. The puncture was so small that it could have been missed, but it was there, and it prompted investigators to order toxicology tests for exotic substances that would not normally be screened in a routine autopsy. The tests came back positive for propofol, a powerful operating room anesthetic used to induce unconsciousness before surgery. Propofol is the same drug that killed Michael Jackson years later, and in 2005, it was not a substance that would be available to the general public. Investigators checked pharmacy logs at UF Health, where Oliver O'Quinn worked as a nurse anesthetist, and discovered that O'Quinn had stolen propofol from the hospital. Michelle had suffered from severe migraines, and O'Quinn, who was obsessively infatuated with her, had offered to help with her headaches. She trusted him completely. He told her he was giving her a safe migraine remedy. Instead, he injected her with a lethal dose of propofol. After her death, O'Quinn fled the country, traveling first to Ireland, then to Mauritania and Senegal, in an attempt to avoid extradition. He was eventually apprehended and brought back to the United States to face trial for first-degree murder. Oliver O'Quinn was 27 years old when he murdered Michelle Herndon. He worked as a nurse anesthetist at UF Health in Gainesville, Florida, a position that gave him access to powerful anesthetic drugs used in operating rooms. O'Quinn was obsessively infatuated with Michelle, who was a friend of his roommate. The infatuation was one-sided. Michelle did not return his feelings, and there is no indication that she was aware of the depth of his obsession. O'Quinn had no prior criminal record and was regarded as a competent medical professional by his colleagues. But his fixation on Michelle had grown into something dangerous, and when she continued to reject his advances, he decided that if he could not have her, he would take her life. Michelle Herndon was 24 years old when she died. She was a student at the University of Florida, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Michelle suffered from severe migraines, a condition that caused her significant pain and discomfort. She had tried various treatments and was open to suggestions that might provide relief. When Oliver O'Quinn, a nurse anesthetist, and someone she knew socially through her roommate, offered to help her with her migraines, she trusted him. She believed he was using his medical training to provide her with a legitimate treatment. Oliver O'Quinn stole propofol from the hospital where he worked. Propofol is a short-acting anesthetic used to induce unconsciousness in patients before surgery. It is administered intravenously and works quickly, causing a rapid loss of consciousness followed by respiratory depression. In the wrong hands, it is a lethal poison. O'Quinn told Michelle that he could help her with her migraines, offering her what he claimed was a safe and effective treatment. Michelle agreed to let him administer the treatment. On November 8, 2005, O'Quinn injected Michelle with a lethal dose of propofol. She lost consciousness almost immediately. The drug suppressed her respiratory system, and she stopped breathing. Michelle Herndon died in her home in Gainesville, Florida. After her death, Oliver O'Quinn fled the country. He traveled to Ireland, where he hoped to avoid extradition to the United States. When authorities began closing in on him in Ireland, he fled to Mauritania and then to Senegal, countries with more complex extradition agreements. He remained a fugitive for years. Michelle's body was discovered during a welfare check after friends became concerned that they had not heard from her. The initial examination did not immediately reveal a cause of death, but the autopsy uncovered the tiny needle puncture. The puncture prompted investigators to expand the toxicology screening to include exotic drugs that would not normally be tested. The tests revealed propofol in Michelle's system. Propofol is not a drug that would be found in a typical overdose case, and its presence immediately pointed to foul play. Investigators contacted UF Health and requested pharmacy logs for propofol. The logs showed that Oliver O'Quinn had access to the drug and that there were discrepancies in the inventory that suggested he had stolen it. An international manhunt was launched. O'Quinn was located in Senegal and extradited to the United States to face charges of first-degree murder. The trial took place in 2008 in Alachua County, Florida. The prosecution presented the pharmacy logs, the toxicology results showing propofol in Michelle's system, and testimony from witnesses who described O'Quinn's obsessive behavior toward Michelle. The defense did not present a credible alternative explanation for how Michelle had come to have propofol in her system, or why O'Quinn had fled the country if he were innocent. The jury convicted Oliver O'Quinn of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Oliver O'Quinn is 46 years old. He is incarcerated in Florida and will remain in prison for the rest of his life. Michelle Herndon was a University of Florida student who suffered from severe migraines and trusted a nurse anesthetist when he offered to help her. His medical credentials gave him the access, and his obsession gave him the motive. Michelle Herndon trusted the wrong person with her migraines, and it cost her her life. The tiny needle puncture and the exotic drug testing that followed were the only reasons the crime was discovered. Without those findings, Michelle's death might have been attributed to natural causes, and O'Quinn might never have been caught. Case 9. Caitlin Conley. Mary Yoder died in a hospital bed after days of excruciating gastrointestinal distress. The 60-year-old co-owner of Chiropractic Family Care in Sauquoit, New York, had been a beloved figure in her community, a woman who treated her employees like family. One of those employees was Caitlin Conley, a 23-year-old office manager who had been in a toxic on-and-off relationship with Mary's son, Adam Yoder. By July 2015, the relationship had ended badly, and Caitlin decided to exact revenge. She would murder the person Adam loved most in the world, his mother, and then frame him for the crime. Caitlin used clinic funds to purchase colchicine, a medication used to treat gout, under a fake name. She administered a lethal dose to Mary, then wrote an anonymous letter to police, framing Adam, and planted a bottle of the poison in his car. As Mary lay dying in the hospital, her organs shutting down from the colchicine poisoning, Caitlin sat by her bedside, comforting the family and offering support, all while knowing exactly what was killing her. Investigators tracked the IP address of the computer used to purchase the poison and found that it led directly to Caitlin Conley's phone. Caitlin Conley was 23 years old when she murdered Mary Yoder. She worked as the office manager at Chiropractic Family Care, a clinic co-owned by Mary and her husband. Caitlin had been involved in a relationship with Adam Yoder, Mary's son, for several years. The relationship was toxic, marked by frequent breakups and reconciliations, intense arguments, and emotional volatility. By 2015, the relationship had ended for good, and Caitlin was consumed by anger and resentment toward Adam. She blamed him for the breakup and wanted to punish him in a way that would cause him the maximum amount of pain. The solution she arrived at was to kill his mother and frame him for the murder, ensuring that Adam would lose the person he loved most and be blamed for her death. Mary Yoder was 60 years old when she died. She was the co-owner of Chiropractic Family Care and a beloved figure in the Sauquoit community. Mary had treated Caitlin Conley like a daughter, trusting her with responsibilities at the clinic and welcoming her into the family. Mary had no idea that Caitlin harbored such rage toward her son, or that she was capable of the violence that was about to be inflicted. Mary was a healthy woman with no underlying medical conditions that would explain the sudden and severe illness that overtook her in July 2015. Caitlin Conley used funds from the chiropractic clinic to purchase colchicine, a medication used to treat gout, from an online pharmacy. She used a fake name to place the order, but she made the purchase from her own phone, a mistake that would later prove critical to the investigation. Colchicine is a toxic substance that, in high doses, causes severe gastrointestinal distress, organ failure, and death. The symptoms of colchicine poisoning are excruciating and prolonged. In July 2015, Caitlin administered a lethal dose of colchicine to Mary Yoder. The method of administration is not entirely clear from the public record, but Mary ingested the poison and within days became violently ill. She experienced severe gastrointestinal symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain. She was admitted to the hospital, where doctors worked to determine the cause of her illness. As Mary's condition deteriorated, Caitlin sat by her bedside. She comforted Mary's family, including Adam, and offered support and sympathy. She acted as though she were as devastated as everyone else by Mary's mysterious illness. In reality, she knew exactly what was causing Mary's suffering. She had poisoned her. While Mary was in the hospital, Caitlin wrote an anonymous letter to the police, claiming that Adam Yoder had poisoned his mother with colchicine. She planted a bottle of colchicine in Adam's car to support the accusation. Mary Yoder died in the hospital after days of agony. The anonymous letter tipped police off to the possibility of colchicine poisoning, and toxicology tests confirmed that colchicine was present in Mary's system. Investigators began looking into the allegation that Adam had poisoned his mother, but the evidence did not support the claim. Adam had no motive, no access to colchicine, and no history of violence. Investigators shifted their focus to Caitlin Conley. They obtained a warrant to examine the IP address of the computer used to purchase the colchicine online. The IP address led directly to Caitlin Conley's phone. She had made the purchase herself, using clinic funds, from her own device. The frame-up unraveled. Caitlin was arrested and charged with murder. The first trial took place in May 2017 and ended in a mistrial when the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. Caitlin was retried in November 2017 in Oneida County. The prosecution presented the IP address evidence, the anonymous letter, the planted colchicine bottle in Adam's car, and testimony about Caitlin's toxic relationship with Adam. The defense did not present a credible alternative explanation for the evidence. The jury could not agree on murder, but they convicted on first-degree manslaughter, 23 years in state prison. The distinction reflected the jury's conclusion that while Caitlin had caused Mary's death, there was not sufficient evidence to prove that she had acted with the specific intent to kill required for a murder conviction. Caitlin Conley is 32 years old. She is incarcerated in New York and will remain in prison for the foreseeable future. Mary Yoder was a beloved community figure and devoted mother who was murdered by her office manager, a woman she had treated like a daughter. Caitlin Conley poisoned Mary to get revenge on Mary's son, then sat by Mary's hospital bed comforting the family as Mary's organs failed, knowing exactly what was killing her. An office manager murdered her beloved boss to punish the boss's son, then planted evidence to frame him for his own mother's death. The IP address trace that led to Caitlin's phone was the piece of evidence that unraveled the frame-up and exposed the truth about what she had done. Case 10. Dr. William Cybers. The district medical examiner for Panama City, Florida, held a position of ultimate authority over death investigations in his jurisdiction. Dr. William Cybers was the person responsible for determining causes of death, ordering autopsies, and ensuring that suspicious deaths were properly investigated. He was also a man in severe financial debt who was carrying on an affair and wanted to marry his mistress without the expense of a costly divorce. On May 30th, 1991, Cybers murdered his wife Kay with succinylcholine, a paralytic drug used in surgery to temporarily paralyze patients during procedures. After injecting her with the drug, he called for help and claimed she had died in her sleep. Then, using his position as district medical examiner, he rushed Kay's body to a funeral home and ordered it embalmed immediately, destroying any toxicological evidence before a proper autopsy could be performed. Local police deferred to his authority and did not question his handling of his wife's death. It took a massive public outcry to force an exhumation, and it took another 10 years for forensic scientists to develop the techniques necessary to detect succinylcholine in embalmed tissue. Dr. William Cybers weaponized his job investigating deaths to cover up his own murder. Dr. William Cybers was 58 years old when he killed his wife. He served as the district medical examiner for Panama City, Florida, a position that gave him authority over death investigations and access to controlled substances used in forensic analysis. He was highly connected within local law enforcement and the medical community, and his professional reputation meant that his decisions were rarely questioned. Cybers was in severe financial debt by 1991, a situation that placed strain on his marriage and his lifestyle. He was also involved in an affair and had decided that he wanted to marry his mistress. A divorce would have been expensive and would have divided his assets at a time when he could not afford it. Cybers decided that murdering Kay was a more convenient solution. Kay Cybers was 52 years old when she died. She had been married to William Cybers for more than 30 years and was a well-known figure in Panama City social circles. Kay trusted her husband, a doctor and medical examiner. On the night of May 30th, 1991, Kay suffered what appeared to be a mild asthma attack. William offered to treat her, using his medical training to administer what he claimed was medication to help her breathe. Kay accepted his help. William injected her with succinylcholine, a drug that would paralyze her respiratory muscles and cause her to suffocate. Succinylcholine is a paralytic drug used during surgical procedures to temporarily paralyze patients, making it easier for anesthesiologists to intubate and ventilate them. When administered outside of a controlled medical setting, succinylcholine is lethal. It paralyzes the respiratory muscles, preventing the victim from breathing. The victim remains conscious and aware as they suffocate, unable to move or call for help. William Cybers injected Kay with succinylcholine on May 30th, 1991, in their home in Panama City. Kay's respiratory muscles were paralyzed, and she suffocated. Cybers waited until she was dead, then called for help. He claimed that Kay had died in her sleep, possibly due to complications from her asthma. Because Cybers was the district medical examiner, local police and emergency responders deferred to his judgment. Cybers used his authority to bypass the normal autopsy process. He rushed Kay's body to a funeral home and ordered it embalmed immediately. Embalming destroys most toxicological evidence, making it nearly impossible to detect poisons or drugs in the body after the process is complete. Cybers knew this. By ordering the embalming before an autopsy could be performed, he ensured that any evidence of the succinylcholine he had injected would be destroyed. Kay's death was initially accepted as natural, but there were people in the community who were suspicious. Friends and family members who knew Kay questioned whether her death had been as sudden and unexplained as Cybers claimed. A public outcry eventually forced authorities to reopen the case. Kay's body was exhumed, but the embalming posed a significant challenge. In 1991, there were no reliable forensic techniques for detecting succinylcholine in embalmed tissue. The drug breaks down quickly in the body, and the embalming process had destroyed most of the biological material that would normally be tested. Forensic scientists worked for 10 years to develop new techniques that could detect traces of succinylcholine in embalmed tissue. In 2001, the new techniques were applied to samples from Kay's exhumed body. The tests came back positive. Succinylcholine was present in Kay's tissue. Dr. William Cybers was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial took place in 2001 in Florida. The prosecution presented the toxicology evidence, testimony about Cybers' financial troubles and his affair, and evidence that he had rushed Kay's body to embalming to destroy evidence. The jury convicted Cybers of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But the conviction was overturned in 2003 on a legal technicality unrelated to the evidence or the facts of the case. Cybers was granted a new trial. Before the retrial could take place, in 2007, Cybers accepted a plea deal. He pled guilty to manslaughter in exchange for a reduced sentence of 10 years. Because he had already served time in prison awaiting trial, the plea deal amounted to time served and probation. Cybers was released due to his failing health. Dr. William Cybers died in 2014 at the age of 81. He had spent only a fraction of the time in prison that a life sentence would have required, and he had avoided a second trial by accepting the plea deal. Kay Cybers was murdered by her husband of more than 30 years, a district medical examiner who used his position to bypass the autopsy process and destroy the evidence of his crime. He weaponized his literal job as a medical examiner to cover up murder, and it took a decade of forensic science advancement and massive public pressure to bring him to justice. Even then, a legal technicality allowed him to plead down to manslaughter and avoid life in prison. Kay's family was left without the full measure of justice they had sought. But the toxicology techniques developed to solve her case have been used in other investigations and have helped bring other killers to justice.